Welcome to the next and exciting panel entitled Armed Actors Across Porous Borders. My name is Tobias Hagmann. I'm a fellow with the Rift Valley Institute and a senior program officer with SwissPeace. I'm a former academic, so I'm allowed to ask both academic and policy questions. This panel today is closely linked to some of the other panels, in particular the one yesterday morning on conflict and regional contestation. We will be hearing about, in particular, Al-Shabaab and other armed groups operating in the Somali borderlands. And it's quite obvious that this entire workshop is entitled Cross-Border Conflict and Insecurity, and therefore armed actors, both state and non-state armed actors, are of course both part of the problem and part of the solution when it comes to insecurity. I'm joined today by three esteemed colleagues, Stephen Buchanan-Clarke, Orly Stern, and Nisar Majid, and they will be briefly introducing themselves. Why don't you go ahead, Stephen?
Oh, there we go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Buchanan-Clarke. I work for Good Governance Africa, an NPO based in Johannesburg. I head up their Human Security and Climate Change Program.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Orly Stern. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. And I work as a consultant in the humanitarian sector, with my focus being primarily women in war. So the intersection of gender and conflict is where my work looks at. And for the last 4 or 5 years, my life has been very Somalia Al-Shabaab focused. And I worked in the Al-Shabaab defectors program for a number of years. And I've carried out a number of pieces of research around Al-Shabaab, looking in some of them at women in Al-Shabaab, over the last 2 years at child recruitment by Al-Shabaab, and in a previous job at men in Al-Shabaab. So Al-Shabaab and its membership has become a real focus of mine. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. My name's Nisar Majid. I don't really have a disciplinary focus. I'd say that I'm a Somali studies person, so I'm interested in the Somali territories, the Somali people, in the Horn of Africa, in the diaspora. I've been working in the region since the late 1990s in different capacities, initially in food security, early warning, livelihoods analysis, in diaspora and transnational studies, and then over the last 4 or 5 years, and currently for the LSE, on political economy, conflict research, political research. Thanks.
Thanks, Nisar. We already saved 2 minutes because I will make sure that this panel will end at 12:30 on point. I have 2 preliminary remarks. So there's a bit of academic in me. I don't apologize, but let me acknowledge it. 2 quick points. The first one relates to the discussion we had yesterday about community in the borderlands, right? And here I want to draw your attention to a large body of academic work done by geographers and anthropologists who study borders and boundaries and borderlands around the world. There's even a specialized Journal of Borderland Studies. And what these colleagues are basically saying, and I'm simplifying to the extreme, is that there are 3 different types of borders or boundaries, right? I'll make this very simple. There are some boundaries that basically cut across one community, right? The same community, the same people living on both sides of the border. Example, the boundary between Somalia and Ethiopia. You will find Isaac people on both sides, right? So that's one type of border. Then there are other borders that separate different social or ethno-linguistic or whatever kinds of groups. So the border coincides with the administrative border coincides with the ethnic or social boundary, right? Think about, for example, the regional border between Afar and Nisar. And here often you will see it's a very different type of border, different types of contestations, which often center around, where should the border be, right? Who owns what type of land? Okay, that's the second scenario. And thirdly, we have many borderlands where we basically see frontier dynamics. It basically means that these borderlands have a history of settlement where other groups, I'm using this word for lack of another word, other groups, often from the highlands, often agriculturalists, have either moved there for labor, as part of resettlement, and you often have these contestations between those groups that consider themselves the indigenous groups and the settlers, right? So these are 3 very different types of borders. So if we talk about borders and borderlands, we need to take that into account. We cannot generalize across borders, but the politics of borderlands is often a reflection of these different types of borders. And in addition, in all 3 cases, you have people who move, who are not from these borderlands, because they move because of whatever reasons. So that's the first remark. And the second one, we're coming to our panel on armed actors. I think it is important to have a realistic take on armed actors. Now, states and donors are not particularly fond of non-state armed groups, and they have their own and good reasons for this. But in reality, and again, that's what academic work shows around the world, armed groups come in very different forms and shapes. And to understand armed groups, I find it helpful to ask the following 4 questions, and you can maybe reflect about those during this panel and later on. So 4 questions or 4 issues to think about. The first one is the agenda. So apart from seeking power, do these armed groups have a political agenda? Firstly. Secondly, local relations. What is the level of local buy-in or support that these armed groups have by local communities? Or put in other words, to what degree do these armed groups articulate local political demands? Immediately, you can figure out that there's a lot of variation, right? Third point, service delivery. What is the ability of a particular armed group to deliver services, in particular, A, basic security, and B, conflict resolution, which often means adjudicating, resolving conflicts, in particular, land conflicts. And fourth, and classic question and criteria, what is the organizational and what are the financial capabilities? So how cohesive is this armed group internally? What is their military capacity? Is the armed group able to generate fiscal revenue, or are they basically externally funded? So agenda, local relations, service delivery, organizational and financial capabilities. These are, I think, key criteria. And if one considers and applies these criteria, it quickly becomes clear that this basic distinction between state versus non-state armed groups makes little sense, right? I mean, if you're formalistic, you can always say, well, there's armed groups, state forces, and there's non-state armed groups. But if you apply the other criteria, you will see that it's impossible to classify, to continue using this classification. So in other words, the behavior of armed groups is not primarily determined by whether they are state or non-state, but by their agendas, local relations, service delivery capacity, and internal capabilities. And with that said, we'll start with our presentations. We have 3 presentations in a row. Stephen will start with a presentation on the North Mozambican Tanzanian border. We then have Orly focusing on Al-Shabaab and women in and across the border. And then we'll finally have Nisar taking a broader regional Somali viewpoint. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tobias, for those opening statements. I think they really frame the panel really well, and hopefully my remarks will speak to that. Also, before I begin, I just did want to thank Ruth, her team at XCEPT, FCDO, all of the panelists. I think it's been a fantastic 2 days, and I've learned a lot. So I did just want to extend my thanks there. So today, just my opening remarks, what I'd like to do is provide a really quick overview of the context in northern Mozambique, for those of you who may not be too familiar with that context. Provide just some top-line key takeaways from the research we're currently engaged there, and then provide some policy recommendations or lessons learned specific to the Mozambican context, but which I hope have applicability and relevance to some of the other contexts we described today. I do have a slide, if we can just move to there. No, yeah, there we go. Okay. So just an overview of the Mozambican context. Since 2017, there's been a conflict with its epicenter in Cabo Delgado, fought primarily between militant Islamist group, also known as Wajama, and the Mozambican state, with support from regional and international actors. About 5,000 civilian deaths to date, with over 1 million displaced. So security early responses by the government were to hire private military companies to tackle what they perceived at the time, I think, as really a banditry problem. And that included hiring the Wagner Security Group and later Dyke Advisory Group. Those initiatives failed to improve the security situation. In October 2020, Al-Sunna launched initial attacks into southern Tanzania, in the Pwani region. They also overran the major provincial port city of Mozambique prior. Then in 2021, Olsen launched a coordinated attack on the Amarula Hotel in Palma, and this was really a turning point in the conflict. It gained international attention. There were about 200 foreigners staying there, working at the LNG onshore facility in the Fungi Peninsula. Dozens were killed. And for the first time, I think the Mozambican government really had to publicly acknowledge that it wasn't a banditry problem. You have a concerted insurgency there. At the same time, Total Energies, which is the primary extractive industry player of the Rovuma Basin, declared a force majeure, pulling its operations out until the security situation improved. A month later, President Nyusi signed a bilateral security arrangement with Rwanda. RDF and Rwandan police forces deployed shortly after, about 2,000. And a month after that, SAMM, the Southern African Development Community, deployed a multilateral peacekeeping force comprised of Lesotho, South Africa, Botswana, and Tanzanian forces. Since these deployments, the insurgency has adapted. As you'll see from the map, these are violent incident reports over the last 12 months. Attacks have moved, the base of operations also have shifted southwards and westwards, and they've even done some attacks into neighboring Niassa and Nampula provinces. They've also changed some of their, I think, strategic thinking, which I'll get into a little bit later. So yeah, that's just the context to base some of my key findings. The objective of our research, which XCEPT is, we're partnering with XCEPT on, is to understand some of the cross-border dynamics of the conflict, as well as the impact of the policies to date to deal with the conflict. Why is this important? Firstly, because there's an overwhelming discussion and both security and developmental and humanitarian efforts now to deal with the problem in Cabo Delgado. However, we know that it is an extensive conflict system with roots and webs that extend outside of that province. So in order to develop effective regional strategies, to be preventative, to avoid conflict spillover, we found it really important to better understand these dynamics. So just a couple of key findings, because I know my time is limited. Firstly, Tanzanian nationals make up the largest foreign contingent within Al-Sunnah, and it's heavily represented among its leadership. Abu Hassan, who is one of the key leaders, who the US State Department has sanctioned, is a Tanzanian national. There's a historic connection between the historically marginalized Mwani ethnic group in Cabo Delgado and the Mtwara ethnic group on the Tanzanian side of the border. There's been intermarriage and the strong relationship between those communities. Many of the VEOs of Al-Sunnah's early leadership were linked directly to radical religious actors in southern Tanzania, and I think the impact of Tanzanian clerics in northern Mozambique is quite profound on the religious landscape. There's been training camps discovered in Kibiti and further south, although those have been destroyed now. Lastly, funding from southern Tanzania was an important part of the establishment of the group in Cabo Delgado. In order to break into both the illicit and illicit markets in Cabo Delgado, which are quite extensive around the middle trade, around timber smuggling, around the drug trade, often locals would go to southern Tanzania to get loans, and then to pay back those loans, a percentage of that would then go to the insurgency. There's also evidence of Al-Sunnah interacting with other smuggling networks in the region in terms of taxation, and there's extensive illicit revenue streams from human trafficking to mineral trafficking and timber trafficking. And then there's also some evidence, although it is quite limited, of Tanzanian nationals based in Pwani area helping in direct transfers through M-Pesa and other Hawala networks into northern Mozambique. However, since these security deployments, both by Rwanda, by SAMM, the shutting of the borders, which occurred in 2021, those two main border posts, Namonto and Negamano, we've seen less direct engagement between southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique. Um, the impact of this border closure and security patrols in this region have been quite negative on communities both sides of the border. There are really significant commercial trade between the two regions, foodstuff, clothes, a lot of local merchants in northern Mozambique will go into southern Tanzania to buy these things to sell in northern Mozambique because they're seen as a higher quality. There's a lot of cultural ties between the two regions, not just in terms of the ethnic groups I mentioned, but a lot of people in northern Mozambique listen to southern Tanzania media, support the local Tanzanian football teams. And then, of course, there's the religious ties, the Tanzanian sheikhs, radical actors that have constantly moved between the two regions. So I think the closure of the border have had a negative impact, not just on the local communities, but I think more importantly on local political elites. And this speaks to some of the center periphery issues we've covered in the last day. You know, people still cross, but mostly by sea, although there are some illegal land crossing sites. And I think an unintended byproduct of the closure has also been to empower some of the smuggling networks that are operating in this borderland region. I think at its core, what our research found is that the discovery of hydrocarbons and mineral deposits from between 2010 and 2012 in Cabo Delgado created sort of a pre-source curse, so to speak. Local elites in Cabo Delgado they thought there would be a huge dividend coming from these finds. And essentially what happened was elites from the Maputo area coming into the region, crowding out local content opportunity, speculative land buying, the displacement of local communities, and really angered local political elites, which what we've had is a sort of successive wave of disenfranchisement through this aggressive security approach, whereby the closure of the border has again disrupted the local political economies, and it's really alienated those political elites that you need to get on your side to effectively engage in counterterrorism. And then lastly, some recommendations based on those findings. So I think what we found is security in these very porous border regions is reliant on hybrid orders. There's this notion that they are ungoverned spaces. In reality, I don't think they are ungoverned spaces. It's just who's governing those spaces. You may not like them. It may be illicit forms of trade, but there are always hybrid forms of governance, even in places like southern Tanzania, northern Mozambique, which are very far from the centers of power in both those countries. Any intervention must be grounded in a real thorough assessment of the local political economy and how these security interventions will interact with local actors, local elites. Counterterrorism, I think, in itself is a very state-centric response, and it's often the impulse of state to trying to aggressively assert their authority in regions where there's a security challenge. Sort of a negative consequence of that is you end up alienating the people who you really need to get on your side. Another recommendation is around framing, and I think it was something that was touched on earlier. I think for policy recommendation intervention to really land, it has to be in line to an extent with the incentives of the political elite of the government. For example, asking to open up civic space and empower communities in areas that historically don't vote for the incumbent party months before a national election is just it's not realistic. However, what we've had some successes, I feel, in terms of our role in policy recommendations, is if you can frame it as empowering local communities to address and expand security coverage in low access areas. That is something that resonates with government, especially a government that is looking to improve security so that LNG operations can recommence. Lastly, we've spoken about various actors over the last 2 days. And in the northern Mozambique context and southern Tanzania, the role of private sector and multinationals is absolutely critical. And this is often the case. You know, mining companies operate often in borderland regions, far from the center of power. In order to operate in these hostile environments, they rely on private security sector actors, and they end up being sort of de facto governments sometimes in these low access areas. For example, Total Energies has colloquially often called Total Land, the Fungi Peninsula. They have extensive security operations in the region. They and in some ways they are providing some of the basic governance services, you know, access to justice, service delivery, those sorts of things. So I think in a context like northern Mozambique, where there are big governance challenges, when a multinational comes in, it's really important that their exploration and exploitation of the resources there is based on a real good political economy analysis. Is also a deep understanding of the governance challenges in the region. It's not about an ESG tick box exercise of retraining some fishermen displaced in carpentry. It's about understanding the governance challenges and really becoming a development partner. And I think it's in the long run economic interest of these companies as well. As we've seen in northern Mozambique, it's almost been 2 years now of force majeure. And I think a lot of this could have been avoided with corporate social responsibility, investing in the right areas to build resilience in those communities who are very at risk of recruitment and radicalization. And I think, yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'm looking forward to some discussions and following up on any of the key points. Thank you.
Many thanks, Stephen. And we'll get back to this particular question of what could policy responses look like, in particular policy responses that have a regional outlook, right? Because these are complex regional conflict systems. I'll ask the audience to think about this particular issue when we get into the Q&A. It's your turn, Holly. Go ahead.
Great. Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. So we know that armed groups cross borders for a number of reasons, be they military reasons, social reasons, economic reasons. What I'm going to speak to today is the way in which armed groups deploy women over borders for them for many of these things. I'll focus specifically on the way that armed groups deploy women across borders for economic reasons, but I'll touch on some of the rest. Much of the focus of what I'll talk about will be Al-Shabaab, but I'll give a few other examples from other places just to show that this is not a unique thing that happens in one context alone. So armed groups deploy women across borders for all sorts of things. And amongst them are economic reasons. Well, armed groups often send women over borders to trade for goods, to get the goods that are needed in different places, to sell things. And often this is to get the goods that armed groups themselves need in order to survive. And often this is to attain the goods that armed groups need for the populations that they rule. So if there's a population such as the population in Al-Shabaab territory, they need fuel, they need food, they need a number of different goods for survival. And often it falls to women to go to get these things for the territories. And so women are deployed across borders, and in doing so, they carry out absolutely fundamental tasks without which armed groups actually wouldn't be able to survive. They wouldn't be able to keep going, nor would the life under in the territory that they rule be viable. So let me speak to the example of women in Al-Shabaab. We know for a fact that Al-Shabaab uses women in a number of ways. And I'll speak specifically today to the way in which they use women in the cross-border space. So women carry, I mentioned yesterday that women carry out 70% of informal cross-border trade on the African continent. And it's no different in this context. Because women carry out such a large bulk of cross-border trade, Al-Shabaab has also used them in much the same way. And so women are often deployed from Al-Shabaab territory to go and trade goods over the borders, and that's over both the borders between Al-Shabaab and non-Al-Shabaab territory within Somalia, and also over the borders with its neighboring countries. And women are responsible for trading in all the different sorts of goods that are needed, both the goods that Al-Shabaab needs for the group itself, as well as the things that the population in the territory need to survive. And something really interesting is that the women who often carry out these roles are in fact Al-Shabaab wives. There's a lot of testimony of Al-Shabaab wives who are the ones who are often deployed in this way. And it's interesting because many of the women in Al-Shabaab territory are not permitted to work, but Al-Shabaab wives are given this freedom to trade over the borders, to run businesses, even to have a smartphone, which is prohibited for most of the people in the population. And so we've got this, while the population of who lives in Al-Shabaab territory is not allowed to leave for the most part, there's very strict checkpoints and strict rules around entering and exiting the territory. The wives often have this real freedom of movement to cross over, which they do on behalf of the group. There's also a lot of evidence of Al-Shabaab using women to run businesses for the group. And this is done in a number of different ways, but Al-Shabaab often gives women funding to start up businesses. They invest in the businesses of local women, of local tradeswomen, and to get a return later. And so you have women running a lot of the business on behalf of the group. You also have women helping Al-Shabaab engage in some illicit activity. And one of the things which I found really interesting is the way in which women are actually used to help Al-Shabaab in money laundering using the borders. So especially in recent years, there's been a lot of financial controls which have been aimed at inhibiting Al-Shabaab's financing and their ability to earn and their ability to move money. So there's been a lot of restrictions in the banking system. There's been a much more of a heightened knowledge about the way in which Al-Shabaab uses the mobile phone system and the banking system to move money. And there's been a lot of rules, systems put in place to try and reduce that. So it's become much more difficult for Al-Shabaab to move money. And so one of the ways in which they've begun to use money is through women. So what Al-Shabaab will do is they'll take cash on one side of the border. They'll use the cash to buy goods. They'll give the goods to female traders. Female traders will take them over to the other side of the border, and there the goods are once again sold for cash. And that's become one of the popular ways in which Al-Shabaab is moving money through women. We've also seen evidence of Al-Shabaab increasingly using female bank accounts or women's bank accounts to move money through the banking system because, again, women are checked far less. And so I think Al-Shabaab has really taken advantage of the fact that people suspect women less. Women are much less likely to be searched at the borders. Their bank accounts are much more less likely to be noted. They're much more less likely to have the goods that they're carrying with them checked. And this is something which Al-Shabaab has definitely taken advantage of in order to continue their means. Now, this isn't an isolated incident. Around the world where there are armed groups active, we see armed groups using women in all sorts of ways. And certainly this isn't the only situation where an armed group has used women to trade goods or to get goods over the borders. There's been different, this has popped up in lots of different wars, and I'll touch on a few very, very brief examples. So one example from some years back was in Sierra Leonean war, the RUF used to do trade with female traders. So the RUF was for the most part based in the provinces in Sierra Leone, and female traders would come from Freetown with trucks laden with goods, and they would bring the goods to the rebel areas where they would trade the goods with the RUF in exchange for diamonds and for cash sometimes. The women would then take the minerals back to Freetown and sometimes over the border in Guinea, where they would exchange them for traders, and then they would bring goods back to the provinces in turn. This is often extremely dangerous trade for women. There were lots of examples of women killed on the road, lots of examples of women trading goods with the RUF, getting diamonds, and then half an hour later, as they went down the road, being attacked by those self-same rebels to get the diamonds back. So cross-border trade for women, particularly when it involves armed groups, is dangerous work. Lord's Resistance Army, another example. LRA, we've got a lot of evidence that they used women to get goods over the borders and to procure the goods that they needed. So the LRA would take women, often women who they had abducted and forced to be part of the group, and they would deploy them to South Sudan, to Kenya, to work in the markets and to trade goods. In the late 1990s, when the relationship between Khartoum and the LRA declined or was no longer good, and the LRA could no longer rely on Sudan for goods, they started increasing the number of women who they were then deployed to go and work in the markets in Juba and to work in the markets in Kenya to try and attain the goods that the group needed. So why is this important? Why do we need to know about women? And to link it back to the point that I made about yesterday, it's so important to not look at women because we're looking at vulnerable groups, and it's important to not forget them because shame, they're vulnerable. It's absolutely not, that's not the reason to look at this. The reason to look at this is because if we want to truly understand what's going on with these groups, and if we want to truly understand how to formulate strategies to degrade war economies, to counter-terror strategies to really deal with these problems, if we can understand the part that women are playing, we can make much better tailored strategies. If we're looking at armed groups and we're completely blind to this part that women play. If we're just not seeing that part of the picture, we're missing a very, very important picture. And then any of our interventions which are aimed at dealing with this are just going to be fall short. And so I would always say, for the sake of doing any of our jobs properly, we get a much fuller picture, and we get a picture which a much more actionable research and much more actionable evidence if we notice the part that's played by women. And with armed groups, it's no different. If we can see the absolutely fundamental parts that women are playing for armed groups, then we really have a whole nother avenue in which we can address this. Thanks very much.
Excellent, thank you. And I do have a quick question, because you were very short and rapid and condensed. When you say Al-Shabaab deploys women, they use women, the immediate question is, what's the agency of these women? Because it all sounds like, do this, do that, but you could also say this is as part of female empowerment, right? So what's the agency?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's different in different situations. So in some situations, and also the same answer can be different in the same situation. So in some situation, women want to help the armed groups. They're part of the armed groups. They're members of the armed groups. Some of the Al-Shabaab wives that I spoke about are as committed to the cause and as committed to the movement as any men are. So on the one hand, you've got women of tremendous agency who want to be there, who believe in the idealized messaging of the group, the radicalized messaging of the group, who believe in everything of this, and they're doing this on their own accord. In many other situations, you've got women acting with a lot less agency. I spoke to the example of women abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. We knew that the LRA abducted thousands and thousands of young girls to be part of their ranks and to carry out a number of different roles for the group. And so in those cases, we've got women acting with absolutely no agency at all. They're abductees, they're held in the group, and those are the roles that they're being sent into. And then there's a full myriad of options in between as well. There's women who become compelled who do this for money because they want to earn. Sometimes they do it because they're absolutely desperate for money, because that's the only way they can feed their families. Sometimes they do that because they want to profit. As with men, women become involved in these movements in a range of different ways, some with agency, some without. But it's really, really important to be noticing that.
And do you think you put the first slide up? Thanks. Okay, hello again, everybody. And my talk is going to briefly focus on Somalia and the Ethiopia-Kenya-Somalia borderlands. I'm primarily drawing on work done under the LSE Conflict Research Program, which was the predecessor of Peace Rep. And I must first of all mention my colleague Khalif Abdirrahman. Many of you, actually several of you, know him. He's a fellow of RVI. A lot of the work that we do, a lot of what I'm going to say today depends very much on our collaboration. He's a brilliant researcher, a brilliant analyst, and a real activist within the program and in his personal capacity. So he should have been here, but we weren't able to get him here. So that said, I want to talk about two things today, or make two main points. One is to emphasize that there are numerous armed actors in the cross-border spaces we're interested in. Sometimes we're thinking just about Al-Shabaab, perhaps some of you are, but we should think that and I'll point out, and as this map indicates in the pictures on the right, is that there are numerous armed actors, and I'll introduce the idea of a security arena to help to frame this rather than a sector. Secondly, I'll focus a bit on Jubaland, area that Khalif and I have done a lot of work in, to illustrate some of the cross-border and transnational conditions and connections that contribute to Al-Shabaab's presence as a cross-border actor, as one of many, and that inform the point raised yesterday, actually, that one has to talk to all levels, or to take all levels of governance seriously. So if you're looking at dynamics in Jubaland, it very much pulls you into Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya at different levels of non-state and state interaction. So Alice Hills writes on security governance and developed the idea of the security arena, and describes how security actors or armed actors in many African contexts operate in a dynamic arena rather than in an institutionalized sector. And she points to the personalized patron-client relationships and rivalries that characterize this arena, and that this is poorly understood by those working on security sector reform, and which you could certainly extend to our borderlands. So this is particularly important for policy purposes. So given that, we could ask who populates this arena in the border areas of Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And some of those pictures point to to some of the different groups. So this includes the national armies of Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, the ENDF, the SNA, and the KDF. There are different federal member state regional forces in Somalia. There are special forces. There are paramilitary groups. There are the Liu police being one of the most kind of notorious and effective in their own way of Somali region of Ethiopia, and other special forces like Gorgor and Danab and Kenyan special units as well that operate on the Kenyan side of the border. As well as that array, you have a whole numerous set of Somali clan militias that those of you working in the region know have been mobilized over the last 9 months or so against al-Shabaab. You've got private military security companies, and then you've got organizations or entities like al-Shabaab, ISIS in Puntland, Al-Sunnah wa Jamaa, and the ONLF, who may be not so active at the moment, but are part, if you look at the last 5 years, of this security arena. So I think, that's quite an array of different armed actors that you're dealing with in these border areas. So not all of them act across international borders if we want to take international borders as our main focus. And certainly not just al-Shabaab. And as Toby pointed out, if you start to look at some of the characteristics of these groups, there are many similarities, in fact. And what might some of these be? So, and what are some of the characteristics of these groups? So certainly in this area, they can wear different hats. So you can be a member of a clan militia one day and a government soldier another day. You could actually be you could be in both positions at the same time, acting as clan militia, wearing government or official uniforms. They have different patrons. Some of them are external, regional, related to the Gulf, related to the West, and some are domestic. Some don't have patrons as such, and al-Shabaab maybe is slightly different in terms of it generates its resources from local taxation. So most importantly, I think, or particularly important, they have considerable financial interests and motivations, this collective group. Security rents and taxation of trade are the two of the major kind of areas that these groups are all interested in. And this point is particularly important as this also draws state and non-state actors together into often shifting alliances for the purposes of sharing resources. And al-Shabaab is certainly involved in such relationships with other state actors. The Kismayo corridor is one of those corridors that has been for which there is a certain amount of documentation about relationships between the KDF, between Shabaab, between the Jubaland security forces. So these relationships can change over time, but one should recognize that they exist. And they have different relations to local populations, but all also act violently and are known to commit atrocities on local populations, all. So you could take an example of the Liu police of Somali region, ostensibly formed to fight the ONLF as a tool of the ruling EPRDF party, and they became later the tool of the previous president of Somali region, Abdi Ile, in his tyrannical rule, very violent rule of the region, and in which his regime took over much of the regional economy and acted across borders through this enormous border between Somalia and Ethiopia. So that's a little bit of background. If we could just turn to my second slide. And apologies for my very amateur efforts at putting a map together on the right-hand side. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about Jubaland a little bit more deeply, as it illustrates some of the dynamics that I've just spoken about. And this is a very simplified example. But the current president of Jubaland in southern Somalia came to power in 2019 as the result of an alignment of state and clan interests, particularly within Ethiopia and Kenya. So Ahmed Madobe, the president, and the current president, is from the Ogaden clan, and had taken Kismayo port from al-Shabaab with his clan militia and with the support of the KDF in around 2010. And the Ogaden clan are a very interesting kind of identity group, if you want. I mean, I'm generalizing very much over a very large identity group. But the Ogaden clan are a transnational group that are politically influential in Ethiopia and in Kenya, and populate the southern parts of Jubaland. And so in 2013, there was an alignment between Kenya and Ethiopia and the Ogaden clan in support of the nomination and the eventual kind of election of Madobe as president of the region. And in 2019, there was a shift that took place as a result of changes in Ethiopia. We had a new prime minister, Abiy Ahmed. We had a new regional president, Mustafa Omar. And then you also had a new president in Somalia. So this, and I think this is also obviously something that we're very aware of in the Horn of Africa, is that there is a great deal of political turbulence, not just now, but as an ongoing feature of the region. And so as a result of some of those shifts in Ethiopia and Somalia, there was a new dynamic, there was a new election in 2019, and then you saw Ethiopian interests changing in Somali region itself, as well as from Addis, moving against Madobe, and Kenyan interests supporting Madobe. Ultimately, Madobe stayed in power, but there were a lot of tensions and localized conflict around that, and kind of this illustrates really that, and you know, having spoken to different people over the last day or two that are working on cross-border programming, that if you're going to understand some of these cross-border dimensions, you've got to understand these different kind of layers, and I'm obviously just touching upon them, but Jigjiga, Addis, Garissa, Mandera, Nairobi, Mogadishu are all important hubs at which important players are located that are influencing these different shifts, political shifts that in turn influence the activities of armed actors in that area. So I mentioned these issues also because there are certain characteristics of Jubaland that are worth highlighting. One is that Kismayo port is a major trading hub and an important corridor to Kenya with benefits for all armed actors. I've indicated that earlier. And similarly, the Belet Hawa-Mandera border point in the northern part of Jubaland is an important taxation point. So I realize my time is up, so I'm going to finish, or just about up, with a couple of points. One is, well, what does this mean for Al-Shabaab? And there are two factors that come to mind. One is that partly as a result of these shifts, I mean, Al-Shabaab is very present on both sides of the border, of this border area in Kenya and Somalia, and its headquarters really is in the middle of Jubaland itself, in Middle Juba. And so without a proper political settlement in Jubaland since its inception, this has given space for Al-Shabaab to operate in. So this is one of my points. There's been a lack of a political settlement within Jubaland, and this is why I used this map, is that if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you've got a very nice portrayal of the different administrative units in Somalia. On the right-hand side, you've got a very poor version by myself of a much more, what we saw in the map previously by Orly in terms of Al-Shabaab presence. You've got a much more scattered arrangement of armed actors that represent different kind of territories and populations in different parts of the region. And Jubaland, in some ways, really has only ever been a reflection of this area, and perhaps trade into Kenya and this area, and Gedo itself is now separated from Kismayo and from southern Jubaland. So when we talk about places and we look at maps and we talk about areas like places like Jubaland, actually they are a much messier kind of arena of different types of actors. So my last point is that the Kenyan this is about conditions for Al-Shabaab. The Kenyan approach to managing security in this Somali populated area is perhaps quite different from that in Ethiopia. Its militarized approach is driven from the center. Atrocities take place against local populations, and there's a much more kind of transactional ethos. And you could contrast this with the Ethiopian side, where there is a more decentralized management of security involving local actors in terms of intelligence and security provision, and where there is a greater capacity, therefore, perhaps to understand and engage with the local context. And perhaps while money changes hands, there is a greater emphasis on intelligence and security management. So those are my last 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, presenters. You did a very good job. You're very good analysts. You're sticking to time. I very much appreciate it. Your presentations raised so many points. Let me highlight 3 or 4 that struck me. One is the need to understand the role of local political elites in the borderlands. A second point, what is the role of companies, but also more broadly the private sector when it comes to armed groups, insurgencies, and counterinsurgencies in borderlands? A third question that I sometimes ask myself, are states only becoming interested in much neglected borderlands once there's an armed rebellion? Question mark. And finally, and maybe the most important question for this panel and this session and this day, what should policy responses look like that are based on, a regionalized approach and that take into account these different realities?